Hello YouTube! This is Alpha White Wolf bringing you a game review rather than the movie reviews that have since been uploaded to the channel in the last couple months. Now, if you've been paying attention to the uploads that have been going on the channel recently, you will notice how the Saints Row series has just recently finished being uploaded into its little playlist. You will also have noticed that the series has been played in reverse order. Now, to address why I'm doing a Saints Row game review at all, most of the time, and I've actually had to explain this to some of my coworkers, a lot of the time when I'm doing a gameplay walkthrough, my goal is to try and get people who might stumble across this video to take a look at it and think that looks interesting, and then be inspired to investigate into the game and potentially be interested in getting the game, playing the game, and then from there finding related games and expanding upon their existing game library. My review of the Saints Row series, however, is more to address certain things that I liked, certain things that I didn't like, and specifically to address some things that I did in the first two games. Now, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get on with the actual review, shall we? To start off, we have the one that most closely resembled the Grand Theft Auto series. Saints Row 1 was enjoyable in that its storyline, specifically the order in which you could eliminate the rival gangs, was decided upon by the player. This aspect of gameplay allowed for a playthrough of this game to be a storytelling experience, where your choice about which gang gets eliminated first, second, and third can almost feel like you're creating a movie rather than playing a video game. For me, the first gang to go in Saints Row 1 was the West Side Rollers, and I took them out for three reasons. 1. Lynn and her planning allowed for her to infiltrate the Rollers quickly and then start disrupting them from within. 2. The Rollers were the smallest, pettiest gang, whose areas of influence was a rather small corner of the map with a few hoods further south in the southern half of Stillwater. 3. Compared to the other gangs, the Rollers were the youngest and the least deeply rooted in comparison to the Vice Kings, and certainly in comparison to the Carnales. On the other side of things, the final gang, and I will be getting into the second gang in a moment, the final gang was the Carnales, since, aside from border skirmishes, they seemed at the time more content with what territory they had. So it seems to me that they would largely ignore the Saints' territory grabs until their hoods and operations started to be taken and threatened. As promised, the second gang. The first and last gangs were established before I even started playing this game again, so that left the Vice Kings to be tackled second. This was actually for a number of reasons in and of itself. Chiefly, early on in the Vice King missions, we learned from Gat that there is a growing dissent in the upper ranks of Benjamin King's gang. This dissent really comes to a boil when Tanya and Warren attempt a coup, resulting in Ben helping the Saints finish off the Vice Kings and essentially assisting us in our takeover of Stillwater. Furthermore, considering that King didn't perceive the Saints as a threat, likely due to the monolithic scale of their territory and power at the time, I concluded that his gang would not be the last to go. A pragmatic mind like Benjamin King would see the Saints as a very real threat if he had just watched two other gangs get destroyed. So it seems likely that the Vice Kings weren't the last gang to be destroyed, while their size and power meant that they were unlikely to be the first either. The epilogue was actually one of my favorite parts, favorite and frustrating, and was a clever use of public opinion and assassination in politics. Alderman Hughes has his mayoral opponent Marshal Winslow killed, followed by the assassination of Police Chief Monroe at Winslow's funeral. When I was looking at this, having it revealed to me by Hughes, I couldn't help but admire the vicious use of violence to achieve political power, even if my guy got blown up in the end. Saints Row 2 picks up a few years after the end of Saints Row 1, and deals with the protagonist having to rebuild the Saints as its new leader. Just as before, the rival gangs can be dealt with in any order, and just as before, this can lend itself to some pretty good storytelling. As with Saints Row 1, I chose a particular order to deal with the other gangs, and I started with the Brotherhood. To put simply, the Brotherhood contacted the Saints, which was something that the Ronin and the Sons of Samdi didn't do. Now this allowed for this initial confrontation to be established and make the Brotherhood a major target in the Saints' crosshairs. Additionally, what Jessica did to Carlos would undoubtedly give a good spark for the boss to utterly destroy the Brotherhood. Much like Saints Row 1, the drug-running gang, the Sons of Samdi, seemed content with what territory and power that they have, and thus would be likely to ignore the Saints until their operations started getting encroached upon. This, coupled with the fact that they don't manage to off anyone of real significance, despite their attempts to do so, makes the Sons of Samdi the last gang that I deal with. And thus, the Ronin are the second gang that I work against. Just like with the Vice Kings from Saints Row 1, the Ronin are dealt with second, not because of what they do, but because of the other gangs being better options to be eliminated first and last. Though what happened to Aisha was a good motivation to destroy the Ronin. The first two games of the Saints Row series are typically regarded as the best games of the series, with the second game being regarded as the absolute best, due to the fact that the first two are grounded in reality. Yes, they have some funny aspects, namely the store names always bring a small chuckle to me, but by and large, they're not as cartoonishly absurd as the third and fourth games. As a side note, there's something that I do with the first two games that isn't as feasible in the third and fourth installment. In the first two games, as the story progresses, the protagonist serves as a visual representation of the Saints' growth. As the Saints grow in power and influence, the protagonist's attire becomes more formal and more expensive. This represents this increase in power with this increase in wealth. Saints Row 3, or Saints Row the Third, was where the series began to depart from its original style and establish its own, becoming, for lack of a better term, goofier. Continuing with the idea of the Saints being incredibly influential following Saints Row 2, mandated that the gang be relocated to a new area, in this case, the city of Steelport. In terms of the game mechanics, the improved graphics as well as keeping the cruise control and visibly quantified respect acquisition, especially in regards to headshots being worth more points, from Saints Row 2 are all excellent, and really show an improvement and evolution in the series. It's really in terms of the story where this game earned its place below Saints Row 1 and 2. I did find Kinsey, Angel, and Oleg rather interesting, but they weren't as compelling as Pierce, Carlos, and Shaundi had been in their introduction back in the previous game. Furthermore, Johnny Gat's death was something that I disapproved of, and Shaundi's new personality was grating to say the least. Personally, I think that Shaundi would have been better with a less acidic personality, said personality being a clear indicator that she had a degree of shame towards her earlier behavior in Saints Row 2, but that's just me. My biggest issue really lies in the story and how it relates to the other games. As I've said, in Saints Row 1 and 2, I would typically use the protagonist's clothing to represent the Saints' progress. In this game, which followed a much more linear storyline, we don't get to choose what game gets tackled first. Yes, I get that it is technically one gang with 3 smaller groups handling various specialized tasks within the Syndicate, but that made this game feel more monotonous than the ones that we took care of in Saints Row 1 and 2. I mean, it was fun to upgrade the weapons and vehicles, and the way that Saints Row 3 allows for player choice to be introduced throughout the story really allowed for some immersive gameplay. But ultimately, my issue is that Saints Row 3, it's too silly. It's fun to enjoy the chaos that comes from such wackiness, but there's a point where it becomes too much to handle. On the topic of enemy groups, Stag was a weird inclusion, but when I first took care of it, it was sort of a sure, why not kind of group to go up against. Though my blood did boil a little bit when they referenced Jessica in a positive light the way they did, and it did make me dislike Stag quite a bit. On a combined subject of both Stag and player choice, who honestly picked the Killbane option at the end of the game and let Shaundi die? I mean, I said it earlier, I dislike Shaundi's new acidic personality, but I would still pick her over helping Angel any day if the alternative was letting her die. Saints Row 4, though, took the silly wackiness of the previous game and just ran with it. Once again, it was largely against a single enemy that was composed of different groups that handled levels of opposition for the protagonist. Frankly, there were times when the absurdity of the game made completing it a chore. Yes, the superpowers and the White House opening cutscene made it really fun, but the massive number of side quests to gain an advantage and to achieve the best game ending made returning to play this game a bit of a tedious chore. It's clear to anyone who looks at these games that Saints Row took its cues from the Grand Theft Auto series initially, but it did begin to go its own way after a while. And while this is admirable, there is a reason that Grand Theft Auto has released as many games as it has. Saints Row 1 and 2 did as well as they did because they were grounded in reality despite having their fun. They did have their funny moments, but it did not come at the expense of the in-game logic. Saints Row the Third begins to go down the wonky path, while Saints Row 4 swan dives into the realm of absurdity. This makes the Saints Row series a prime example of one very simple fact. Just because you improve the graphics and add some fun doesn't mean you improve the game. The fact that Gat Out of Hell, what little I've played of it so far, feels like a DLC that's been expanded into a full-size game shows that what happened with Saints Row 4 was probably not the best course of action, despite the fact that it was funny and could have its fun times. On the topic of Saints Row 4, to make a little digression, the 4th game in the series was actually the first game of it that I played, and Saints Row 4 actually is what inspired me to play Saints Row 1, then 2, and then 3. Bit of an interesting thing when the last game of the series is the one that inspires you to play it at all. But getting back on track, that's really all there is to be said about this game series' later editions. There are lots of quantity, but they're not as much quality as was present in the earlier editions. They're fun, they're enjoyable, but they're just not as good as those earlier installments of this series. As with any kind of video like this on Gaming Glatorius, this is just my opinion. So if you disagree, then note that my statements are just that, mine. And if you want to have a debate with me, then go ahead and comment down below. I love getting into conversations with the viewers. On that topic, comment down below if you want to see anything specific on the channel, like if you enjoyed the video, and hit that subscribe button if the inclination strikes you. This has been Alpha White Wolf. I'm signing off.